Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski, and what I wanted to do was to create a video in which I talk to you about the ones who walk away from Omelas, to kind of give a little lecture to maybe help you better understand the story. Because sometimes students kind of have a hard time with the story. Sometimes at the start of the story, Ursula Le Guin uses a lot of detail, and sometimes that details can kind of overwhelm the reader. But really, everything changes once you get to it, right? The big event. I will tell you that the reason why we read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is because Omelas really comes down to argument. So let me give you a little lecture. Hopefully you are watching this after you've read the story itself. But notice when Ursula Le Guin starts off the story, she sets it off in the town of Omelas. And Omelas is called to be the most happiest place on earth. And it really means you can do anything and everything your heart desires in Omelas. So when I start off teaching Omelas in a ground class, I always ask students, like, kind of, where would you imagine that you'd set Omelas, given that's the happiest place of earth? And some people, for me, where I imagine setting it is I imagine setting in this picturesque, beautiful city. It's kind of a small city. For some reason, I kind of think of setting it in Lake Tahoe or setting it in Vail, Colorado, right? Because I know that Omelas is kind of close to a lake and close to the mountains. It's picturesque. It's beautiful. I think sometimes I might set it in Amsterdam because, in Amsterdam, it's a beautiful city. I actually went to Amsterdam over the summer with my family. And even today, I think, God, Amsterdam's such a beautiful city, right? But you can do everything your heart desires, right? In Amsterdam, you can go to a coffee shop. They offer coffee, but you can, smoke some marijuana, some drugs. So Amsterdam's the happiest place on earth. You could set it in some place like Las Vegas, right? A place of joy where you can do anything your heart desires, including gambling. Or you could set it in Disneyland, the happiest place on earth, right? And what does it mean that Omelas is the happiest place on earth? Because in Omelas, the people, they can do anything they want. They can do anything they desire. They can do drugs. They can walk around naked. So maybe we should set it in Berkeley. But they can do anything that their heart desires. But then when we find out, and my original short story is wrong, is what students tell me, right? But because in my memory of the story, once in your life, you have to go. You have to go to spot X, and if you go to spot X, there is Y. And if you go to X, right, X can mean many things, right? I always view X as the cellar, the basement, the broom closet, the town center. But if you go to X, and let's just say it's the center of town, right, and there's a cellar, in that cellar is Y, and in Y is that suffering child. If I would pick up that child and present him to you, notice that that child would be suffering. He'd be covered in sores. He'd be covered in his own feces. We don't even know if that child talks anymore. Sometimes it mumbles, sometimes it says nothing, right? And what they tell us is that the entire basis of the foundation of society is based on that child. There is nothing you can do to help that child. If you do anything to help that child, society will crumble. And notice that some people are shocked. They're outraged, right? Some people just weep and cry. Some people kick the baby. But at the end of the story, right, some people are so frustrated, they walk away. And my question is, I wonder if those people who walk away, do they make a difference? Do they really make a difference if they walk away? And I like my original version of the story, reading of the story, because in my version, my memory of the story, you have to go. Because if the entire foundation of society is based on this suffering child, I think you have to go. You should know about the child. But some students have read the story and told me, no, it's optional. You don't have to go. You know about it. And I think that's a bit of a cop-out because they said, the entire foundation revolves around this suffering child. And if you do anything to help this child, society will crumble. So I think you should be forced to go. Now, the key to understanding the story is to ask, what does the child symbolize? What does the child represent? So if you look at the story, there is textual evidence that the child could be like a Christ-like figure, right? Because they say the child is there for your happiness. The child suffers for your happiness. So there is an implication that the child could maybe symbolize a Christ-like figure. But sometimes students have had the best interpretations of Omelas, because I one time taught this story in a summer school class, and I had a bunch of students who were going to school at San Diego State, They came back for the summer because they wanted to take a cheap summer school class. And one of the students said they thought the child could symbolize Mexico. I said, Mexico? How did you come up with that idea? And they said, well, if you think about it, you're 18, 19 years old, you're going to college for the first time, you're away from home, you're in San Diego, but you can't legally drink. But what students do is they cross the border, they go to Tijuana, and they can do anything their heart desires. They can drink, they can party, they can see a donkey show, right? They can do anything their heart desires, and then they just come back across the border. And if you think about it, that's a really great example, because if you think about it, right, Tijuana at one point was one of the poorest cities in the world, poorest cities in Mexico. And San Diego is one of the most prosperous, wealthy cities in the United States. So that's a great example. The child could symbolize Mexico, or it could symbolize third world countries. I one time had a group of students say, hey, they think the child symbolized Nike, the shoe company. And they said, well, if you think about it, Nike makes a good product, they make a good running shoe. If you think about like things like the LeBron James shoes might cost anywhere, let's just say they cost $500, and people would spend $500 on those shoes. But where does Nike make its product? It makes its product using sweatshop labor, child labor, right? So Nike would be a great example of what the child could represent, right? So I think the key is to ask ourselves, what might the child symbolize? What might the child represent? And what I want you to do in kind of the discussion board is to kind of ask yourself, what do you think the child might represent or might symbolize? And the reason why I would argue that the story itself is represents rhetoric, and the child could represent rhetoric, is because, if we look at they say, there's nothing that we could do to help this child. If we did anything to help this child, society would crumble. So if we look at the child and we ask ourselves, how long is that child going to live, given its conditions, right? Given the conditions, it's got sores, it's covered in its own feces. Well, that child may not have long to live. Maybe it has a year longer to live. Well, if that's the case, and there's nothing we can do to save the child, that means society will crumble in 1 year. So it's rhetoric to say, hey, we can't save that child. Why can't we save that child? And I had one student who asked a great question. I don't think there's textual evidence, but he said, what if you looked deeper in the cellar and you saw there were more children? Well, that would make the story super creepy, but it would also suggest that it's nonsense and it's rhetoric to say we can't save the child if you just have another child to represent it. And one of the other things I think is interesting is we could also argue that the child symbolizes gas and oil. If you look at the child, he's sort of covered in a layer of black filth and kind of grime, right, and grit, so it could symbol coal, gas, or oil. And if you think about it, where do we get most of our oil? Historically, we've gotten our oil from, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, countries that exploit their own citizens. Women don't always have equal rights. I think in Saudi Arabia, women only just got the right to drive a car by themselves, right? But society is dependent on gas and oil. And notice, but despite that, right, we want cheap gas and oil, right? We want gas and oil that comes from these, Middle Eastern countries. And if you think about it, if you turned on TV and it said, hey, oil and gas is going to run out tomorrow, right, what would happen to society? Well, society would start to crumble because we base so much of our economy based on gas and oil, unless you own an electric car, which is like way to go. But I just want to give you these examples. I hope that it sort of gives you some ideas of what the story is about. And I think the key to understanding the story is to ask, what does the child symbolize or represent? So that's part of a discussion board. I'm going to look forward to see what you think. And I'll be excited to read your essays for week 2.